Hello, this is Colin Liddell, and this is the Shortpod, a brief and succinct commentary on almost anything that springs into my mind. And today it is the 21st of July 2021, and the topic I would like to discuss this time is the last 4 or 5 years of the distant right and American electoral politics. Now, the dominant historical narrative that is emerging is that the alternative right and the distant right in general was a kind of hapless political movement that rose up, had a brief moment of glory, and then fell apart in a shitstorm of egos, doxing, recriminations, etc., etc. The main reason being that it was a sort of a shit magnet that attracted lots of mentally unstable personalities. There is, of course, an element of truth to that, but that's only a fragment of the story. I think that what happened to the distant right is part of the bigger picture of American politics, and especially the Trump years. It is simply not credible to see the distant right and Donald Trump as separate phenomenon. And this also raises the issue of just what exactly was Donald Trump and the Trump phenomenon. Of course, it's pretty easy to come up with basic bitch punditry explanations for what Donald Trump was, but none of the explanations that are booted about really convincingly explain all the available evidence. And there is quite a lot of extremely troubling and discordant evidence out there that any wide-ranging explanation has to include within its orbit. For example, Trump, although hardly a radical figure, was deeply and intensely detested by the establishment in a way that really simply doesn't make sense unless you accept all the most lurid characterizations of Trump as a second Hitler, etc. Another piece of extremely hard to assimilate evidence is the pattern of censorship we have seen. While all sorts of things could be said about this, to keep it simple, there are parts of the pattern of censorship which kind of stick out like sore thumbs and raise all sorts of troubling questions. Back in 2015, 2016, while the censorship of obvious neo-Nazi trolls fits into a kind of narrative of big tech being triggered into censoring these people by hate speech laws in Europe, for example, the deplatforming of extremely milquetoast characters like Milo Yiannopoulos and Stefan Molyneux, and the kind of spiritard wing of the internet like Alex Jones and David Icke, none of that really makes sense except as part of a much deeper and more troubling picture, which kind of brings us back to Trump. The key thing about Trump is basically ideologically a Rockefeller Democrat. But for some reason, his rise through the political system, through the primaries, and his victory in the presidential election sparked off a most intense and rabid kind of deep state and establishment backlash, which didn't end for the full 4 years of his presidency, and which led to all sorts of underhanded expedients to remove him from power in the 2020 election. So what we're seeing here in the rise and fall of the alt-right or the dissident right, and in this kind of very counterintuitive pattern of censorship, and in this surprisingly deep establishment distaste for Trump, are fragments of a much bigger puzzle. And what I think is going on is that there is a pattern of covert geopolitical warfare that has been waged between America and other geopolitical rivals. Now, when you say geopolitical rivals to America, there are only a handful of countries that spring to mind. Chief amongst them are Russia and China, and possibly Iran to some degree. Now, let me be clear, I'm not necessarily blaming these countries for taking an oppositional stance to the United States and the West. But my point is that there is something going on, and that this had a massive effect on American politics during the Trump years, and was also intimately connected to the rise and distortion and fall of the dissident right. Now, for many years, I have been an avid consumer of Russia Today's content. Many years before that, I was also a consumer of Radio Moscow's content during the last days of the Soviet Union. So, over the years, in a very kind of macro-empirical way, I've noticed certain patterns of what the Russians are up to. And presumably this also applies to the Chinese more recently. And what they have been always in favor of doing is promoting strife and division in countries that they perceive to be rivals and enemies. This is also something that goes back even to the 1920s and the 1930s with the Comintern, which sought to create divisions in certain Western European countries as well as America, and presumably the Tsarist system may have been adept at this as well. Now, in the old days, this sort of communist or Russian espionage was limited by certain factors. There's only so much that small cells of disinfo agents can do in the era of radio and television, but with the advent of a relatively open internet, it became much easier for America's geopolitical rivals to culture jam American and other Western societies by exploiting the characteristics of the internet and social media. The methods used would be to promote certain divisive narratives, to boost certain personalities and characters and movements that would lead to division and social conflict in those enemy societies. A very clear recent example of this was the case of the English football team and the black players who unfortunately missed 3 penalties in the penalty shootout against Italy in the European Championships. Somehow this was kicked up into a massive controversy in the United Kingdom about how racist or how non-racist British people were, and this huge hysteria turned out to be based merely on a few Instagram accounts located in a foreign country that were clearly pushing a narrative of racism in order to trigger the British left. Black Lives Matter could be seen as a similar movement. Of course, there are racial tensions in America, but these have been boosted, and not just by people in America, but also, I presume, by foreign actors. A case I'm much more familiar with, though, is the alternative right. As a founding member of the alternative right, as somebody who was there at the beginning and followed its trajectory all the way through, I was often struck by how freakish and unnatural the patterns of development were. The movement was certainly boosted and hyped at key moments and pushed in different directions that were not really intrinsic to its original nature. In a sense, the movement was hijacked for a very obvious and blatant metapolitical objective. And this happened especially in 2015 when, somewhere, somehow, it was decided that Donald Trump would be an ideal character to push for the American presidency. Like I said, Trump is basically what's known as a Rockefeller Democrat, somebody who's basically quite centrist on most issues, not very remarkable in his ideological outlook, but someone who is much more remarkable for his rather boorish and polarizing personality. The thing that most people like about Trump, the fact that he was an outsider, is also exactly the sort of thing that America's geopolitical and metapolitical rivals also liked. By pushing Trump into the limelight, they could not only destabilize the neocon tendencies of the Republican Party, but they could also activate a kind of culture clash along the fault lines driven into American society by its attempt to pursue certain racial and gender woke issues. And this is exactly how Trump played out. He was seen as somebody who was deeply offensive to liberals and women, to gays, to blacks and minority groups, etc. Although, in point of fact, Trump was very, very far from being any kind of radical. Rather, he was somebody who was very, very keen to assimilate himself to the establishment and the elites. But the way that Trump was memed, the way that he was hyped and pushed, was very, very symptomatic of what was really going on. In a sense, Trump was given an alt-right gloss, and the alt-right was given a Nazi-esque gloss. And so by Nazifying the alt-right, and then by alt-rightizing Donald Trump, the bad actors in this case, probably the foreign governments I have alluded to, were creating a very divisive element, and possibly they had very little idea of how far this project would go. In the event, of course, Trump went all the way to the White House, where he spent 4 years doing his best to assimilate himself to the political establishment and also to pander to the groups that he supposedly had offended, blacks, women, gays, etc. This would also explain the otherwise inexplicable resentment and animosity from the deep state, from the establishment, from big media, from big tech, etc. There was a relentless, non-ending backlash against Trump that went on for 4 years. And the only real way to explain that is that these people, the people at the top of government, the people at the top of the corporate ladder, the people in the inner circle of American power, knew exactly what Trump was. They knew that he had, in a sense, been foisted on them as a foreign psyop. Now, of course, Trump himself wouldn't really know what was going on. He would have been selected for his personal characteristics, for the spin that could be put on him as a divisive, polarizing figure, and then he would have just been pushed into the middle of American politics by various mechanisms of social media manipulation, and one of those would have been the alt-right itself. This would also explain the pattern of censorship that we started to see following the rise of Trump. What was realized was that there was a pattern to how Trump was hyped, which involved a wide range of actors, the so-called wide tent of the then alt-right, which included genuine nationalists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, neo-reactionaries, various types of people, conspirators, Alex Jones types, David Icke types. There was a kind of synergy between all of these groups that could be used to funnel and direct discontent in a way that could have a decisive impact on American politics and American society. So, in conclusion, the explanation for the unnatural degree to which the establishment detested Trump can be explained by the fact that he was perceived as a foreign weapon. Secondly, the trajectory of the alt-right was manipulated in such a way as to toxify Trump and make him into an even more divisive character, and that this created the characteristics of the alt-right and led to its downfall. And this process also explains why social media took the course that it did take, an attempt to reassert some kind of gatekeeping function. So the entire political history and metapolitical history of the last 6 or so years has been dominated by a kind of geopolitical shadow war. Over and out.